Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another instalment of the Teacher's Newsroom. Tonight we have special guest Caitlin Simmons joining us to discuss her stance on teaching and how she has addressed three key standards. So welcome, Caitlin. Thank you for joining us. Perhaps firstly, we could hear about your teacher's stance.
Thank you, Joshua. So first of all, I'll just give you a little bit of background on my stance as a teacher. So as a teacher, I always try to implement the constructivist approach into my classroom. So Hinchy describes this approach to be student-centered and talked about the fact that the focus is on student learning rather than teacher instructions, as well as the fact that students draw on previous knowledge and make connections to deepen their understanding of knowledge. I believe that for students to make meaning to the information you're giving them, they need to be able to develop these connections, so it needs to relate to them in some way. So I found that the use of ICT in the classroom is a great tool to allow for student-centered learning. It allows them to explore the information they're learning for themselves and research things that interest them. Students are growing up in a world that's heavily reliant on technology, and as a teacher, it's our responsibility to teach them how to use it not only effectively, but also safely. ICT can be used to allow students more freedom, so they're able to research topics that interest them, and that will again create those connections on a deeper level. So as well as this, ICT is also a great tool to use when differentiating, and so I'll touch on that a bit later. As I mentioned before, students need to connect with what they're learning with their previous knowledge. It's important to realise that all students come to school with different prior knowledge and different previous experiences. So this is what Pat Thompson described as students' virtual school bags. So again, if you're able to relate to these virtual school bags and what they're learning, then the students are going to be able to make meaning and deepen their knowledge. As well as students' virtual school bags, it's also essential that as a teacher, you let the students see and understand your virtual school bag. So you need to create these relationships in order for the students to trust you. And again, they will open up and you'll get a lot more out of them.
Yes, that all sounds great. So Caitlin, how do you address standard 1.5? Differentiate teaching to meet the specific learning needs of students across the full range of abilities within your classroom.
Okay, so differentiation within the classroom is essential in order to cater for all the diverse needs of your students. During my current placement, I've had a lot of experience with this, and at the very start of the year, I was able to be a part of and assist in differentiating the whole year level into maths groups. So we were able to use the results of the pre-test that the students completed to split up the level into three different groups. The group that I would be teaching in my classroom was the lowest group, so I then went about looking at their individual results as well and splitting it up again into three different groups. I found that the use of resources for these kids was very beneficial, as well as the use of ICT tools. I was able to use these resources for each group and just alter the activity a little bit depending on what those kids needed. ICT was a great tool to use for my top group, as it allowed them a little bit more freedom, and they were able to explore what they were learning and work at their own pace. The fact that the students were grouped into ability levels and working on activities that they were capable of, it still extended them, but not too much, allowed them to experience some success. This relates to what McDonald said when he stated that students respond well to success and it can be used as a tool to motivate them. The fact that the activities were implemented at their level really helped with their success and their motivation in overall with mathematics. Okay, so as well as in the mathematics classroom, I've also had experience differentiating within literacy. So on my current placement, I've developed 4 different reading groups for the students to participate in. One group will be working with me on the floor doing guided reading, and then another group will be working together on either a project, Sunshine Online, which is using the iPads, or an activity that relates to the book that they've read together. I found that using these different ability groups has really assisted in student growth. Due to the fact that they're working with people who are at a similar level to them and reading the same stuff as them, they're able to aid each other and assist each other if they're finding any words difficult or struggling to understand the story. So I found that it's created a really strong sense of community within our classroom, and the students are happy to work together and to aid each other. So they're not always looking for guidance from me or coming up if they have struggles. They're working together to try and overcome the struggles before they come to me. So each group will have a different book depending on their ability, and the activity that I assign them will be based on that book and aimed at their ability level. So the group that's working on the project at the moment, they're my top group, and they're really focusing on reading between the lines and not just reiterating what they've read in the story. It's more trying to go deeper and what did the author mean by that. Whereas the group that might be just doing an activity, it might just be trying to find where certain words pop up in the story or something along those lines. So the students are really, like, the activities are tailored towards them, and it's really motivating them to learn because they are experiencing success.
Yes, that all sounds very beneficial. What about Standard 5.1, assessing student learning? How have you demonstrated this?
Okay, so assessment is essential within the classroom as it allows the teacher to see the progress that your students have made and to see areas that you maybe need to readdress at a later date. So on placement, I've experienced both formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment in just the likes of observation, having conversations with your students even, just like how you're going with that, just ask them questions about what they're doing and see how they respond in order to gauge what how they're feeling. I've also had one where we were learning about China and Chinese New Year, and so a form of assessment that I used was just to get the students to make Chinese lanterns. They then were able to decorate them however they felt necessary and however they felt it would relate to Chinese New Year. So this gave me the opportunity to see that what the students had learnt, and if they were decorating it with butterflies and love hearts, they obviously hadn't grasped the concept. Whereas if they were using Chinese symbols and food that they eat at that time of the year, they'd got it, and I was able to tick that box that they knew what they were talking about with Chinese New Year. Some summative assessment that I've done running records. That's been a constant theme throughout placement. I've done a lot of post-tests. The school that I'm at the moment, they have post-tests at the end of each maths unit just to see exactly what the students have learnt. In the same China unit, I got the students to create a Venn diagram. So it had China on one side, Australia on the other, in the middle as similarities. So that was like a final piece to see what have the students grasped from this lesson sequence. What do they know? Are they able to identify a key area of areas that are similar, or are they still struggling with that?
Oh yes, that sounds like you have a lot of experience with that. And finally, can you tell us a bit about Standard 3.2, plan, structure and sequence learning programs, and any experience you've had with it?
Okay, so through my experiences on placement, I found that it's essential to get to know your students and their interests before you even start planning your lesson sequence. So get to know what motivates them, what they're interested in, what they do out of school, and see if you can find ways to incorporate that into your lesson sequence. So this relates to what Hattie and Anderman found when they discovered that when teachers responded to students in ways that are responsive to students' needs, emotionally warm, and that provide for student autonomy, students not only felt more motivated in the classroom, but they also achieved at a higher rate. So by knowing your students, this allows you to create a lesson sequence that will not only motivate them, but will in turn allow them to achieve at higher rates. On a previous placement, I planned and implemented a grade 2 lesson sequence that focused on place value. So before I began planning, it was essential for me to know where the students are at and to know what concepts needed to be addressed in a lot of detail and what didn't need that much attention. So to do this, I had a look at the pre-tests that they completed, and I was able to break them up into ability groups, as I previously mentioned. I then sat down and had a look at the Victorian curriculum. That was to see areas that I really needed to focus on and areas that needed to be addressed, and also to help me when planning assessment. So what did the kids need to be assessed on, and how could I go about doing that in a way that would cater for all their needs? So it was important to not only just have the post-test as an assessment, I needed to be continually conducting formative assessments, and so that was either just questioning the students, having a look at their work, and just all that throughout the whole lesson sequence, not just at the end. So our first lesson, it was very basic. just get to know where they're at, what kids should be where, and what needs a lot of attention. And then we could go from there, see if I needed to change the groups at all. So throughout the learning sequence, I always made sure that I incorporated ICT at the start of each lesson. So that was to motivate them, get them excited, play a little game, maths game relating to place value to get them ready for the lesson. We'd then split up into our groups and we'd go from there. So I always tried to incorporate resources, and these resources could be used, and the activities that went with them were specific to the different ability levels. So I found that using resources and using ICT was a fantastic tool to get them motivated, so they're not just sitting there doing worksheets each lesson, they're actually doing hands-on things and they're working together, again, creating that community feeling within the classroom. So we had 5 lessons on place value. Each one was just building a little bit on each other one, and I found that by the end of the lessons, they'd all had some sort of growth. So they were still at different levels, but every student had achieved success and were motivated and were confident in place value.